I'm so happy that you are with us this evening for this program. This is our penultimate program, and our NACMS Focuses on the Magnificat series. I know some of you have been present for other programs we've done in this series, and we were thinking as a staff when we were planning out this series, we were thinking that we would be missing something if we didn't do an evening or some program touching on the Magnificat and social justice, because it is such a powerful prayer about justice and God's justice. So that is why we have invited these 4 people in the Marianist family to talk to us this evening about their experiences in working for justice within the Marianist family as Marianists, and their reflections about Mary and the Magnificat. And so I will go ahead and hand it over to our panelists. I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. First, let me here we go. Just wanted to remove that. So I'll just hand it over to our panelists to introduce ourselves, and then I'll say a little bit more and we'll get into the heart of the program. So welcome.
Thanks, Gabby. I'm Sarah Gray. I see lots of familiar faces here, so it's good to see everyone. But I am the current director of the NACMS Social Justice Collaborative. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, attended the University of Dayton, where I met the Marianists there and got involved with every Marianist thing that I could. I lived with Marianists in India and became a lay Marianist, and worked a lot in campus ministry, and just hung out with the brothers and sisters and everything. And then from there, I graduated with a bachelor's in education, and have worked with MSJC since 2019. So I've actually been here 4 years, which is very exciting. First started as the assistant director and also worked part-time with MLCNA, which is the lay branch of the Marianist family. And in 2022, just a little over a year, I moved into the director position when Jim Boat retired. In terms of my social justice experience, I got super involved in college with lots of things, and I then volunteered with Mission of Mary in college in Dayton, which is a big Marianist social justice initiative started by the laity. I also worked as an educator for a few years after college, so I worked at a Cristo Rey school, if anyone's familiar. But sorry, my mom's calling me. And then I started volunteering with MSJC just as a volunteer on the death penalty abolition and restorative justice team, because I was really interested in restorative justice, and then moved obviously into more of a staff role and love, supporting all of our social justice initiatives within MSJC and the Marianist family. So very excited to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm Brian Halderman, currently residing in San Antonio, a native of the Northern Kentucky area. Encountered the Marianist family as a student, undergraduate student at the University of Dayton, similar to Sarah's story. Shortly after graduation, joined the Society of Mary and was 15 years religious and transitioned out in 2016. Continued engagement in the Marianist family, mostly through MSJC, but in other means by supporting Tekaboka and Marianist lay communities, and got roped in by Margie to help with the assembly. So continue to stay active and involved in those ways with the Marianist family. I've been doing works of justice for many years. I think obviously being a student at Dayton really helped foster a lot of that interest and engagement in works of justice through the Center for Social Concern and campus ministry. But with MSJC over 20 years now, being involved and helping, being one of the main conspirators to start our work against the death penalty, and being part of that initial group that started that team, and then most recently being involved in the LGBTQ initiative. So that's a little bit of background about me.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you this evening. Thank you for joining us. So I'm Sister Nicole Trahan. I'm a Marianist sister here in Dayton, Ohio. I'm originally from Texas, where I first met the Marianist as a grad student and a new teacher at Central Catholic High School, the Marianist School in San Antonio. And I'll talk more about this later, but my first introduction to the Marianist family was through a conversation about justice. So it's justice and Marianist have always been sort of intertwined in my mind. In terms of the justice work I do or have done, right now I serve as part of the racial justice team for the Marianist Social Justice Collaborative. And I'm very active in our province's work for racial justice and also environmental justice. So that's it on me.
I'm Brother Mitch Schweickart, and I reside in Dayton at Mount St. John, a beautiful place. I spent 17 years early on in the inner city of Cincinnati, also teaching for 22 years at urban school in Cincinnati. So that took up much of my life. In relationship to MSJC, I was part of the conversations prior to the establishment of MSJC. So it was when we were the 4 provinces and the family, trying to figure out what we were going to do together. So I always celebrate MSJC. Presently, lots of I get involved in all kinds of things. I guess my main way I participate is through writing campaigns right now. So mostly through writing letters to. I still believe in the political process and that representatives need to listen to us and hear our voices. So that's kind of what I do a lot of now. So most often, every time I switch on the computer, I'm writing to somebody. So that's the main way. And then just different things that happen here in the Dayton area, when Ku Klux Klan visits or some of the prayer services that they have. So I try and attend some of that. And then just do all kinds of stuff with the Office of Mission and Rector. When we do our lay formation with the students, there's always the background of social justice. So lots of different things. Amen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for introducing yourselves and for being here with us. So what we're going to do now is we've asked each of the panelists to speak for 10 to 15 minutes on their reflections on the Magnificat and social justice. And I'm excited to see the directions that this takes us as we see these folks involved in different ministries and different areas. And when we're finished with that portion, then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. So you all can ask questions and we can have a little bit of a conversation. So that's just the rest of our evening, how that will go. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Sarah to take it away.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Gabby. I did make a few slides. I usually like a visual for myself when I'm listening. Can everyone see what I shared? Okay, great. So, obviously bringing the connection of, being involved with the Marianist Social Justice Collaborative so closely in my day-to-day, I wanted to first, I know a lot of you here have been involved with MSJC, either are currently or have been in the past, but I just want to remind us all of some of the language we use on, how we're advancing social justice in the Marianist family and what we say the Marianist Social Justice Collaborative should and is doing. So for short, we call it the Marianist Social Justice Collaborative, MSJC. I'm going to call it that from here on in, just to save some breath. But we are a project supported by the Marianist Family Council of North America. So that means that all 3 branches are invested in us in multiple ways. people from all three branches serve on our issue teams. There also is always at least one person from each leadership team on our steering committee, on MSJC steering committee, and then the council oversees us, and they also each group commits to support us financially as well. So, the collaborative really was with the sense of being, involving everyone in the Marinus family, lots of multitudes and diversities, but especially including all three branches. And then some language we use to describe what we do, what our hope is in the world and what MSJC should be advancing is that we unite and multiply the efforts of Marinus to act for social justice, to create a more just world and church. We respond to the signs of the times, and we provide opportunities for action, education, outreach, skill building, and advocacy through programming and engagement. So this is kind of the ways we view how we are bringing social justice into the world and into our Marinus family specifically. Right now, our Marinus Social Justice Collaborative has 2 staff people, myself, and then we have an assistant director named Erin Anderson Whiteface, who's great and has been on board just about a year, which is exciting stuff. And we have about 70 plus volunteers working on some of the following projects. I just wanted to list what we're doing right now, this is MSJC's 25th anniversary year. So we have been, existing and thriving and evolving the last 25 years, which is really exciting. We've already put out some stuff around that, but we do have a planning committee who's helping us, create projects and celebrate this year and also look to the future, the next 25 years of where MSJC goes. We have a group called the Adele Social Justice Project, which is a young, mostly made up of young adults, but also for young adults. So it's creating space for young people in the church to commit to social justice and also to find community. We have a death penalty abolition and restorative justice team, an immigrant justice team, an integral ecology team. That's our most recent issue team, which works in partnership with MEEC, the Marinus Environmental Education Center, which is on Mount St. John's campus as well. The LGBTQ plus initiative, which Brian mentioned, he's a member of. And then for racial justice, we have two things going on right now. Sister Nicole mentioned that she's on our issue team. So that's a traditional kind of outward facing project of MSJC, where we're trying to challenge the Marinus family to think critically about racial justice, to act on it in a multitude of ways outwardly, right? And then MSJC also has recently made a commitment to look into how we can organizationally be more anti-racist. So we've gotten some support on that. I'll talk about it a little more later, but we kind of have these two things working in support of one another, doing racial justice in a few ways. We have a group of volunteers that also help us with managing our resources and funding. And we have a women and justice issue team as well. Barb Bell's on that team. She's here participating with us tonight. But the pictures on the bottom are just some recent photos of some of our teams. The left is our women and justice team. The middle is our LGBTQ team, plus some of people who helped plan our last retreat in November. And then the bottom right is our current Adele Social Justice team. Just to say that all of these teams are, made up of volunteers who live all over the US and sometimes other countries as well, Canada, Argentina, who care about, whatever specific social justice issue they sign up to be a part of. And then the teams have a lot of autonomy to create programming, educational resources, advocacy, outreach around that issue. However they see fit each year with capacity and interest of issue team members, which is fun to have a lot of room for kind of moving with the spirit as a volunteer group. And teams mostly meet virtually, but then usually try to meet at least once a year in person. So that's where some of these pictures came from, since people live all over. When I was reflecting on the Magnificat, I've been praying with it the last months, especially kind of in light of this evening tonight. But what really struck me, and I think, on the next slide, I'll talk about how I think MSJC does this. But what really struck me is truly the Magnificat's challenge to us to question and change the status quo, right? So how we normally do things. I think as Mary shares her Magnificat with Elizabeth, she is prophet there. She is talking about what will happen, right? And what God and Jesus can allow us to do. And she clearly says that through and because of Jesus, God is calling for an overturning of the world as we see it. So, she uses language as you all know in the prayer, that God favors the lowly, the humble, the faithful, and God rejects the rich, the righteous, and the proud, which I was struck that even in Mary and Jesus's time, those were seen as things that are normalized or even put up on a pedestal in culture. And we still are doing some of that, right? And God is still challenging us to look at that and question it and see how can we flip that? How can we honor the lowly, the humble, the faithful? How can we see them? And I think what also struck me is just, how relevant this is today, right? To even our sense of the time. So we're living in a world that continues to face conflict in the way of war, either ongoing wars that we're seeing right now, or the potential for war is constant. We live in a place right now, that's dealing extremely with environmental disaster that's touching communities all over the world. We continue to see the divide between the economically rich and poor just become so much more vast, right? And these are just some of the things that struck me based on the Magnificat that I think really relate to today, some of these things we're seeing. And obviously it's so Marianist to look at this prayer and then think of how it relates to us today, right? What is Mary asking us to think about today in terms of the signs of our times and challenging the status quo? And although MSJC maybe doesn't name it aloud all the time, as I was reflecting, I was just so moved with how the Magnificat guides our work. I think MSJC deeply thinks about this question a lot. How can we challenge the status quo? How can we turn the world upside down? How can we rethink things? And I wanted to talk about 3 kind of big ways I think we do that. One is moving beyond just responding to the symptoms of social injustice, right? A lot of us growing up, I know myself, I went to Catholic high school and Catholic college, but sometimes we focus often on service or charity, which deal very much with the symptoms. Giving someone food who doesn't have access, giving women a halfway house if they're experiencing domestic violence, right? But none of those are actually getting to the root. Why are these things happening to people? And I think MSJC, at least aspirationally, but does this in small ways, is working for systemic change, right? With church language and practices within the US, legislatively and culturally, and also personally within our own communities of faith, within even, we like to say some of our teams are communities in their own right as well. How are we modeling that? Not just looking at symptoms, but looking at what are the causes and what are we doing about those? I think another thing that challenges the status quo that MSJC really focuses on is valuing community care and finding ways to do both pastoral and justice work that focus on that community care, right? We still live in a world, and especially in a country that has very individualistic ideals, values, where everyone's meant to do things by themselves, and there's a lot of moral, status given to people based on things that aren't really moral. And I think MSJC really asks the question of how can we do this together? What are the ways that we can create safe space and community for people and remind ourselves that we are interconnected always? I just want to name a few beautiful things that I think our teams are doing that focus on this. So our LGBTQ initiative offers an annual pastoral retreat for LGBTQ Catholics, their families, allies. And it's always a space where people show up and feel seen and heard and loved, sometimes for the first time in a long time. We also are really focused right now on building authentic community space for young adults, both in the Marianist family and the church, which I'm sure many of you know is something young adults are seeking and trying to make sense sometimes of this church and how to be part of it. Another direct connection with immigrant families, our immigrant justice team does amazing work with directly working with immigrant families, hosting them, getting Marianists connected with learning how to do that, and inviting folks in the Marianist family and beyond to be a part of that work. The Women in Justice team is working towards broadening support and appreciation for the work women already do and could do in the church if they were given more space, if we could be fully open to appreciating the gifts that women bring. And then the last one I'll name under this section is just our integral ecology team is working on some really exciting projects that are connected all the way up to a Vatican project called the Laudato Si Action Platform. I see some people nodding, which means you've probably heard of it. But basically, something the team is specifically focusing on is developing accessible resources that we can then help MSJC, across MSJC, but also the Marianist family to actually implement the practice of an integral ecology into our organization and the Marianist family. And integral ecology, is just, I'm going to give a very, very brief description of it. You could read hundreds of pages about it, but the idea that we are completely interconnected. There is this intersection of the cry of our earth and the cry of the poor and the cry of the most vulnerable. And we, are needed to respond to all of that, right? We have this deep need for creation care that goes beyond just being a steward, but actually looking at how can we live a life that is molding those things together. And then the last big category I'll mention where I think MSJC is challenging the status quo is actually investing in solutions to the complex problems of today. So I think by investment, I mean investing people, investing time, investing financial resources. The two big areas we're doing that right now is with anti-racism. So we've sponsored some trainings within MSJC. We're working with a group of professionals who are helping us do that organizationally. And we've also sponsored some trainings for the broader Marianist family. But, we're investing time, resources, and money into that, which we deeply hope will move us forward in that work that is so needed in our world today. And the second way we do it is by investing in restorative justice. The death penalty abolition and restorative justice team has been invested in engaging with restorative practices for at least 10 years, it might be closer to 15, but have really been leaders kind of in this field that continues to grow. The one way we've especially been doing it is investing in training members of MSJC to become trained circle keepers. And circle is just a practice of restorative justice that I could go into more detail later. But it's meant to allow everyone to have equal voice. And we actually use it across MSJC for meetings, for conflict when it arrives, for celebrations, but it's been a really powerful tool that we want to also share more outwardly with the Marianist family. But obviously we are investing in that and will continue to do so. I think the Magnificat means for all of us as Marianists that there's hope to hold on to, even though it's it's a very powerful and striking prayer. There's still hope, like Mary. I just love that piece of it. And I think MSJC really embodies that hope. Like I am moved every day by the volunteers who continue to show up on these really hard social issues that are so deep, both within the church and outside of it, right? And I think that's something really, really rooted in Marianists, having that hope, having that joy to continue to do the work. I think also the Magnificat has a requirement of community. I love that. Mary doesn't keep this to herself. She shares it with Elizabeth immediately upon seeing her. And I think, as we know, social justice can't be done alone. So I love this. I love the prayer and the visual I shared a few slides ago of just like the women embracing and how that's what the work of social justice is, right? It's very communal. And then, my very biased opinion, but a few people have already kind of said this, that social justice work is a core component and call of our Marianist faith. I don't think they can be separated. And the Magnificat, I think, reminds us of that all the time. So the big question I wanted to leave was just for all of us to ponder personally, how am I already involved in and/or how can I get further involved in advancing justice in the world today? Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. Lots to think about. So now I'll hand it over to Brian for his portion.
Thank you, Gabby. Thanks, Sarah, for your insights. Apologies if I'm looking up a little bit. I have a monitor in front of me with my notes, so I'm not looking directly at you. That's why. I just really wanted to start out by thinking about the theme of the program and how the Magnificat connects to our work for justice. I didn't, the thing I think that came to mind right away was just this idea of radical hospitality. and pondering on the image of the visitation and the whole experience of the context of the Magnificat. Several years ago, I was asked to write a piece about the work of the anti-death penalty team, and I don't even remember what it was for. If it was for Justice Jottings at the time or what, but I focused on this idea of radical hospitality and the work that we did to be present at vigils around dates of executions, or and I focused on an experience I had as a student at UD in front of the state penitentiary in Ohio when they were, an execution was being carried out, and it was a very profound experience for me as a young student, and thinking about my place in the world and how I was going to help advance this cause. And so that reflection somehow got published in a number of different places, and it was used in the online VLCFF course on social justice. I think it's still being used. But it makes me think about how it applies to many of the social justice issues we work to advance, not only the anti-death penalty issue. And so what's so radical, I guess, about hospitality, and how does that emerge from the Magnificat? I think that God dwells in the wound of a young teenager. And so in the sense, it's God's making a home, right? It's a place, it's a space. And Elizabeth welcomes Mary and provides a space for her, right? In this whole context of the experience. I was thinking back about Megan McKenna's book. Folks are familiar with Mary, The Shadow of Grace, but I found that book, she wrote that many years ago, but I found it very helpful contextually on Mary, but also particularly on the issue of the Magnificat. And she writes about Elizabeth and Mary coming together as being conspirators in the work, and that they were breathing together, right? Which I just thought was a really beautiful image. And to think about our work of justice and our work together in community as conspirators, right, in this work. Jesus' birth to a world that's not so sure about his prophetic message. And so I kept thinking about that, in terms of what does it mean to be radically hospitable and to embrace and live the Magnificat. So for me, the work of justice is radical and it is hospitable. So it's creating space for this prophetic message that we have on whatever issue it is we might be working on. It's about a welcoming and inclusive posture, right? Creating a posture that's welcoming and inclusive. It's not about making folks comfortable in the traditional sense of hospitality, right? We think, oh yeah, Marianists, we're hospitable, we build community, we open the door, we welcome people in. That's not what I'm talking about, because in fact, oftentimes the work we're doing makes folks uncomfortable. And so I think it's not about how we help make folks comfortable, but it's how do we help folks be comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? How do we help them just sit with it and be with it and ponder with it and understand that uncomfortability? It's the getting outside of your comfort zone kind of thing. It's introducing others and building communities with a common commitment. So I think it's in all of the work we've done, I think sometimes people come to, particularly within the MSJC, I'm thinking about now, come to the issue team curious and interested and wanting to be involved. And those of us that have been involved, it's our role to be hospitable, to welcome them in, and to help build this community around a common work, common commitment. I think there are many themes that I see in Mary's Magnificat that align with our Marianist themes. I mean, if you just think about kind of the core themes of our charism around community, around faith, trusting in this unknown journey that's ahead, of inclusion, a welcoming and warm posture, as I've said. So those, I think, are all, there's many of our, themes of our charism can align with the work we're doing with justice and directly align with the Magnificat. I also think, the key thing for me too is thinking about Mary as first and model disciple. So she really is the torchbearer of our work of justice, of lighting the way. And the Magnificat, to borrow maybe some Jesuit language, is the battle cry, right? The Magnificat is the prayer is the song of praise for us as we do works of justice as Marianists, at least in my mind as I think about it. So the Magnificat helps frame my work for justice. And to go back to Megan McKenna's work in this book, she writes that Mary sings not for herself, but for all people. She not only proclaims the future and the impact of the child, but she speaks of the turnings. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about these turnings, because it also makes me think about the canticle of the turning and the song and all these kinds of things that that align here. But the three turnings that Megan McKenna talks about is the turning of the heart, the turning of politics and power, and the turning of hunger and economics, right? And so this first turning of the heart obviously is centered around personal conversion or awareness, right? The second builds on that in the sense that we're all capable, no matter of our status or place in society, to turn politics and power. We all have agency to do that, right? And the third is really about this kingdom that's coming, or the reign that's coming, the hope of our world, right? And so, having been involved in two different issue teams, as I mentioned, in MSJC over 20 years, there's a lot I could say to kind of align with this, but I think the work most recently that I've been involved in with the LGBT inclusion is where I see this come to life the most. We work to turn hearts in that work, and it's not easy to do. We work to overcome obstacles of politics, either within the Marianist family itself, or within our church, or within our broader society. And we turn toward a future of hope, a place where we see that there's freedom from hunger and thirst for vengeance and division. Because with this particular issue, it's mind-blowing to me how mean people are and how vengeful people are and how divisive people are within the church and outside of the church. And it's like I think I keep coming back to this sense that the work we are doing is not only creating a more hospitable space for me and our fellow team members and individuals we work with, but for the future of individuals that encounter our family, encounter our church, encounter our society. As Sarah alluded to, our team has really developed programming centered in a place of radical hospitality to welcome those that have felt excluded by the family or the church or the broader society. And so I think our retreats are the best example of that, that we've hosted. And those, I have personally seen hearts be turned, by the experience of those retreat programs, to a place of personal conversion for folks. And they've turned the wheels of the church politics and challenged bishops to ponder our place and their call to be the shepherd of all the sheep. And certainly they've turned us toward a reign of God that is hopeful and inclusive of all. And it's been an interesting journey with the team and with those retreat programs and the challenges that we've encountered. And not once, I would say, would a team member have lost hope. There's always been a willingness to say we continue forward, we plow ahead, even despite challenges that we might have encountered in the work. And so I guess I'll just end with some of my reflections. I didn't have a whole lot to say other than just I really think that ultimately the Magnificat is this prayer of praise and hope that we're invited in, and we are invited into the same story and same journey that Mary had. It really calls us in deeper to that story. And so we too should be part of that and celebrate that. We're challenged to use our strength and our power to advance the common good. The pulling those words directly out of the Magnificat, of this sense that we too have strength and power to advance this good and to build a reign of God that is radically hospitable.
Thank you so much, Brian. Okay, I'll ask Nicole to go ahead and begin your portion.
Thank you so much. I mentioned earlier in introducing myself that one of the first things I did with the Marianist family in general was something called the Lay Marianist Formation Symposium. It was an initiative of the former St. Louis province. And I was in my first year working at Central Catholic in San Antonio and going to graduate school at St. Mary's. And I was invited to go to this symposium by a lay Marianist in one of my classes. So a group of us loaded into a van and drove to St. Louis for a weekend. And the weekend was focused on how Marianists do social justice. And what does it mean to be a person of justice as a Marianist? So as I said before, social justice has always been an important part of what it means for me to be Marianist, because that was my introduction into the Marianist family. And when I think about our work for justice, or my work for justice, or the work for justice, I think about the very specific scripture passages, and the Magnificat, or Mary's song of praise, is one of the more central of those passages. And I think the reason for that might be because the weekend that I went to used the Magnificat as our frame for the weekend. And so that has really shaped and colored the way that I think about the prayer itself and the way that I think about justice. So one of the things I wanted to say, I'm kind of I don't know, I like to focus on scripture and text. And one of the things that stands out to me about this particular text is that it's the longest text attributed to Mary. There's not a whole lot that Mary actually says in scripture that's recorded there, but this particular thing was so important, spoken by a woman, to be included in scripture, that I think that speaks to us of its importance and its centrality for us as a Christian family, that it was so important that it would be included. One of the things that I've been reflecting on about this text, and Brian touched on this as well when he spoke about radical hospitality and inclusion and being open towards, is that this prayer for me is really steeped in an understanding of a covenantal relationship with God, a very deep relationship with a personal God who has looked with favor and remembered his people, and has acted with mercy towards his people. And I think that that relationship with God is our starting point for our work for justice. Relationship really is our starting point for justice. The justice work that we do, I think, really hinges upon restoring, repairing, building relationships between us and our planet, among people, healing people's relationships with themselves. And I think that comes from this covenantal relationship with God. One of the justice issues that I'm passionate about, which I mentioned before, is racial justice, which is why I have served as co-chair of the racial justice issue team for MSJC, and I've been involved with that team since its inception. And I think the work of that team is really about just relationships, about the inclusion of all into the life of the community, ensuring that all human life is treated with dignity and that all voices are heard and no one is silenced. Which brings me to what I think is so important about the Magnificat, is the fact that God's action in our world is about creating a new world, turning over the status quo, like Sarah was saying before, turning things upside down. And for me, this is our litmus test as Marianist. With everything that we do, in my mind, should be focused on or framed by who are the lowly that are being raised by this action, who are the hungry who are being filled, who are the proud and the arrogant and the greedy that we are challenging or toppling with whatever action it is that we're taking. For me, and I'm not perfect at that. I want to say that real clear. I'm not perfect at that. But I think it's an important thing to call to mind with every action that we do, but especially in our work for justice. Like, who are the lowly that we're raising up, and who are we challenging, and how? And I think an important part of that is recognizing arrogance and pride within ourselves as people working for justice. I think so often that it's easy for people working in justice arenas to believe themselves to be the keeper of all things true and right, and going about it alone sometimes, which is very anti-Marianist. But so it's not just challenging or toppling the arrogant and the proud outside of ourselves, but within ourselves as well. So that level of humility that we learn from Mary in this. I think it's an understatement, as Sarah was saying earlier, that right now in our society and in our church, we are faced with a lot of challenges and injustices, with violence fueled by fear and racism and hatred, and the treatment of the LGBTQ plus community and women, and the disenfranchisement of individuals and entire communities for the gain of others. There's no shortage of lowly to raise and hungry to fill. There's no shortage of that. And I think the challenge for me, though, is when I look at this and I'm seeing all the injustices and all of the issues that we're plagued with, I can get pretty discouraged because the issues are so numerous and complex and intersectional, and there's so much resistance in the powerful and in the arrogant and in the proud. So I can get discouraged. In fact, just last night, I was talking with a friend about the most recent shootings in the nation. And especially we were talking about the shooting of Ralph Yarl, the 16-year-old who was shot after he showed up at the wrong house to pick up his siblings. And when you see things like this over and over and over again, and so little effort on the part of people in power to work with others towards solutions, it can get maddening, but also disheartening. And then earlier today, I was showing a film to a group of seniors at the high school where I work. The film is called The Letter, and it's about Pope Francis's initiative and the Laudato Si movement to combat climate change. And it's my second time seeing the film, but as I'm watching it and watching it through the eyes of my students and thinking about how little has been done to alleviate the climate issues that we are facing, and how there's such a lack of impetus on the part of corporations and governments to make change. And I get very disheartened. But I think Brian might have mentioned this, that the Magnificat is a place that I go for renewal of hope and reigniting of my passion. So taking that sort of anger, I guess, that I could feel about these issues and channeling it in terms of being passionate for change, renewed by hope. And I think what gives me hope about this prayer is that God is doing something. Mary says God is going to do these things. God is at work through people and through events and through the circumstances around us. And sometimes that means me, right? So the challenge is for me to be ever converted each day and every moment to be the person that is spoken about who can help God bring about this work, right? In society and in the church. And I've always said this has been a kind of something that I've said in a lot of different spaces, that the only way that we can remain hopeful is to actually act. Because if we just sit and wallow in thinking about everything that's wrong, there's no hope in that. So we have to actually do something, but not alone, or with the arrogance, like I mentioned earlier, that we could be guilty of. And I think the Magnificat calls us to address that and to act and to not do it alone and to challenge ourselves and society and our church. So in short, I see the Magnificat as a framework for our justice efforts. It gives us our grounding in relationships with God and relationships with others, our focus or our challenge, and our hope to keep going when, the challenges seem to be overwhelming. This is where our hope can come from.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. A lot to think about there for sure. Well, last but certainly not least, I invite Brother Mitch. Go ahead and take it away. I know he's gonna share some music with us, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and as Brian said, forgive him for looking up, forgive me for looking down, because my text is here, and if I don't stay with it, then we will never finish. Providence is wonderful. Tell me at the end of this so I was inspired about a month ago to throw out what I had planned to do what I'm going to do tonight. And you tell me if Providence isn't working. So here we go. And as I said, I have a script, so I'm sorry for that, but you know how I am. All right. The act of social justice has two main aspects. One is internal or contemplative, reading the signs of the times, reflection, prayer, and reflecting back on our action. The other is external or active, listening to stories of injustice, gathering community, preparation for and participating in social action. That's the first part. The Magnificat is a song. It's a song. After Mary's greeting, Luke tells us that Mary sang. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. Her joy in the vision and hope that these two children to be born would bring to her world filled her spirit, and she couldn't hold back. Her song flowed, filled with energy and promise and love. The Magnificat itself has several main themes. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. God has looked with favor on my lowliness and weakness. God is turning the world upside down. God's promise of mercy and presence is from age to all generations. And this was my inspiration. The way I experienced Mary's canticle for years and years in relationship to social justice is expressed through two different songs, two different settings of the canticle. When we lived in the inner city in Cincinnati and ran our immersion program, when we were planning that, we needed a song to begin the concluding discussion about what the participants could do once they returned to their homes or schools or wherever they came from. We knew we wanted a version of the Magnificat, and we wanted a version that would excite and energize and challenge them. So we listened to lots of versions of the canticle. And then I think it was Brother Paul remembered a Magnificat that he had heard from the songbook Safety Harbor, which had come out several years before. So we dug that out. I had that book somewhere, and I hadn't really given it much thought. I hadn't really opened it yet. And not only did we find our song for the program, but personally, I found the Magnificat that would nourish, energize, and challenge me for the rest of my life. And thank you to Brian for setting this up. It's the Canticle of the Turning. My soul cries out with a joyful shout that the God of my heart is great. And my spirit sings of the wondrous things that you bring to the ones who wait. You fixed your sight on your servant's plight, and my weakness you did not spurn. So from east to west shall my name be blessed, could the world be about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. Though I am small, my God, my all, you work great things in me. And your mercy will last from the depths of the past to the end of the age to be. Your very name puts the proud to shame, and to those who would for you yearn. You will show your might, put the strong to flight, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. From the halls of power to the fortress tower, not a stone will be left on stone. Let the king beware, for your justice tears every tyrant from their throne. The hungry poor shall weep no more for the food they can never earn. There are tables spread, every mouth be fed, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. Though the nations rage from age to age, we remember who holds us fast. God's mercy must deliver us from the conqueror's crushing grasp. This saving word that our forebears heard is a promise which holds us bound, till the spear and rod can be crushed by God, who is turning the world around. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. All social groups readying for action. Let me put this on real fast before I get ready for the next one. Where am I? Oh, all social groups readying for action or celebrating an accomplishment need a rallying cry to gather energy for action. Sports teams chant, ooh, rock groups turn up the volume and headbang. Indigenous folks have traditional dances and chants. Even mobs and rioters produce a kind of rhythmic cacophony. Whenever I am preparing for action or am celebrating an accomplishment, I turn to the Canticle of the Turning. It has become my rallying cry for action. It pumps my blood with energy and helps me recall the vision that our world can and is changing as we work together with the Holy One to bring about a more just world. The verses of this song remind me what the life and preaching of Jesus calls me to. On the other hand, we witness horrors or injustices, or our action fails, or our voice falls on deaf ears or hardened hearts, or we just don't know what to do and we lose hope. We can feel paralyzed or helpless, lost in our own weakness or inability to know how to act. Those who have experienced injustice or horror in their lives have used song to mourn and lament, but also to keep hope alive. The spirituals sung by slaves, the wailing of parents who have lost children to violence, the songs of the hope for a different world from those who have been persecuted, the silent songs of a suffering land. When I feel overcome or can't find a direction to move, I turn to a more contemplative version of the Magnificat. And that's a version that has been with me since my novitiate days. It's John Michael Talbot's version. The themes are the same, but now I am not looking for energy for action, but comfort and hope, and the reminder that God is here in the midst of our suffering, filled with compassion and reminding us that we do have a vision we are striving towards. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord, and my spirit exalts in God my Savior, who has looked with mercy on my lowliness, and my name will be forever exalted. For the mighty God has done great things for me, whose mercy will reach from age to age. And holy, holy is God's name, showing mercy in every generation. God has revealed power and glory, and has cast down the mighty in their arrogance, and lifted up the meek and the lowly. God has come to help servant Israel, and has remembered the promise to our forebears. And holy, holy is God's name. And holy is God's name. Mary sang her Magnificat filled with the joy and promise the birth of John and Jesus would bring. But I also believe that Mary sang her canticle as part of her pondering at the foot of the cross, standing solid in the hope that her loving God shared her suffering and she was holding on to the promise that the world was about to turn in the resurrection. The canto can spur us towards action or offer comfort and hope. Which version of the canticle do you need at this moment? Amen.
Thank you so much, Brother Mitch. Those were wonderful reflections, and I think that what I appreciate about them is that they were all so different. You can give multiple people the same topic and see how they come up with different things, and I think that that's really wonderful. So what we're going to do now is open it up for some conversation and some questions. So I invite you all the participants here. If you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. You can press the raise your hand button and I'll call on you to ask the question or comment. But just to kind of prime the pump a little bit, a question that I had as you all were speaking, each of you, and this isn't for all of you to answer, that might take a while, but whoever might feel called to answer. I think that a challenge for us as Marianists is that we hear the Magnificat a lot, and it can be very easy to just sort of be complacent with it, or to, the power of it it's easy for that to not fall on our ears in the same way. So how do you find new ways in, or new approaches to looking at the Magnificat to like deepen your understanding of that? Yeah, Nicole.
Honestly, I think for me, the most effective way, and this might not be true for other people, it's probably true for Mitch though, that the way that I do it is through song. There's something about the power of a melody or different phrasing, because when you read it out of scripture all the time, or if you read it out of a breviary, yeah, it becomes kind of routine and rote. But there's some beautiful and powerful iterations of it that set to music that I think can be very moving, because it taps into like an emotional sort of response, but it like brings my heart back into it. So that's my first thought as you were asking your question.
Yeah, I'll just concur too. I agree. I think music has been one way. Other forms of art, visual art of the story of the visitation, I think is a powerful one. I'm thinking Brother Mickey McGrath just did our retreat this past year. He has a beautiful image of the visitation. And so just thinking about that as well as a way that kind of resurrects those images and feelings.
Another thing is when I hear stories of people, and it snaps me back, so that of injustices or suffering, or where somebody has accomplished something, and it snaps me back to the Magnificat, and I can say, oh, there it is, that's the reality.
Yeah, and I just echo everything that's been said, but also this time I can't remember who wrote it. I don't have my Marianist Family Prayer Book right in front of me, but a Marianist brother has a beautiful, more modern rendition in the first Marianist Family Prayer Book. So I love seeing like newly written prayers that bring it into today too. I loved sitting with that one this past month.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's something about art. It touches us on a different level than the like intellectual in some ways. So I thought, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So are there any questions that people have, or even comments of something that struck you that was shared. Yeah, Brother David.
On Good Friday, we did a version of the Station of the Cross called Mary's Way of the Cross. So it was taken from the perspective of Mary. I'm not sure if a lot of people have seen that or not. But at the end of each paragraph where Mary is reflecting, she says, or it says, I stood or I sat or I saw, I observed in silence and pondered. Now, this may buy into what Mitch said about the inward, the contemplative. So how do you see silence, Mary's silence, in the work of social justice?
I think for me, there are two places where silence plays out, and I think it would relate to Mary as well. In order to listen, we have to be silent. So, we look at something like the wedding at Cana. How did Mary know they were out of wine? She had to hear, she had to see. And so that's the one place. I think the other place for me for silence with Mary is the act of pondering, just the act of pondering injustice. What do we do? What can I do? Where do we start? And that takes pondering even before, that's the reflection that goes on after we hear the story. Even before we gather the community, it's like, what are the possibilities? Who do I need to? And that takes silence.
I was thinking too that, just to build on what Mitch said, that all of the issues that I've been intimate with, I should say, I guess, in terms of social justice and the work, even I think of all the issue teams that we have within MSJC, there's so much pain and suffering in some degrees related to all of those issues, that in order for us to really work at the advancement of justice, we have to be in a place of listening and understanding those issues in a profound way in order to work at overcoming the injustice, right? And so I just think about when we first started the work with the anti-death penalty team, we discovered that the most powerful stories were coming from murder victim family members to return hearts and conversions on that issue. But that work was deep listening and came from a place of silence to really understand their stories. And we could go on and on with the issues, but that's just what came to mind as Mitch was talking.
That's great. Then we'll go ahead and go to our next question. Alex, feel free to ask your question.
Thanks, everybody. So I don't know exactly how I'm going to phrase this, but one of the themes I noticed kind of as a through line in everyone's really nice presentations was this idea of transformation, and how, just the nature of the Magnificat is a proclamation of God's inbreaking into the world to transform it, to challenge the status quo, to turn everything upside down. And then we kind of see a nice reflection later in the Beatitudes of that same idea. I guess my question is almost in the sense of that, kind of going to what Brother Mitch was talking about with the contemplative and the active, but this is also with what Brian was saying about the turnings of the heart versus kind of power politics and then economics. And again, I think everybody touched on it. My question, I guess, is what advice would you all have for engaging in discernment, like personally or communally, about where you should direct your energy towards contemplative or active in the moment. Not that they're opposed. I think often they work together, those two aspects, but just knowing, maybe that silence is some of the answer, but being able to listen and say, what do I need to do for myself to engage in social justice? Is now a time to be more contemplative and work on personal conversion, or more a time to be active? And I guess the reason I'm kind of asking is, I notice at least, and maybe others share this, have a tendency to kind of, anytime I want to lean on one, I second guess it, and I'll say, oh, I want to be contemplative. Well, this is just analysis paralysis. Or, oh, I want to be active, but maybe I should be the one being a little quieter and raising up the voices of others. And so just any comments on that would be really helpful. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Great question. I just wanted to hop in really fast and say that I think I saw lots of people nodding their heads that that's a common experience. But just what I've noticed with myself personally, and also working with MSJC, like I think really leaning into the curiosity of like what issues are pulling at you most often. We recently had a discussion that Brother Mitch was at as well about ecological conversion and how conversion continues to happen all the time, right? Like we're even within the same issue, or and Brian is an example, like he totally switched teams just because later in life, like he decided he really wanted to work on this other avenue. So I think leaning into the curiosity is really important of your heart, like where is the spirit pulling you? And then once you're there, I actually think, both, maybe what was missed in answering the last question a little bit is that the contemplative piece and the active piece can be done in community. And maybe that's the best place to do it, especially for these complicated issues, right? I think seeing our active issue teams work, like people are stuck in this all the time, even people who are actively involved in this work day to day. But I'm always moved when we're in community and in that space and trust each other and want to be moved together and honor one another. Like those things happen to fall into place better for me personally. And I know I can see that on the teams as well. So finding a community, whatever you're feeling curious about, like really finding a community that will honor that walk with you. It's just something that popped in my head.
Yeah, that goes along with what I was thinking too, and that you were asking Alex about. I think this is what I heard from you, that like, how do you know in a like responding to a certain situation, should I speak up or should I be quiet? And I think for me, oftentimes it's the community that helps me discern that. It's like community, like whatever community I'm speaking of, whether it's the one in which I live or it's another community, but it's like, maybe you've been talking too much. Or maybe it's time to take a step back and let's reflect about this and think. So I think that not trying to sort this out on your own all the time is really helpful.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments that others might like to offer as well? Natalie.
So one thing that I was thinking about, I resonated very much with what Nicole was saying about, keeping hope alive can be a very difficult thing when you look at the world. So I was just curious, I know we talked a lot about like going back to the Magnificat today, but what are some other things that people do to really keep that hope alive for themselves and for others?
That's a great question. I was just thinking too about you have to be attentive to self-care in the work of justice and know when it's time to kind of take a step back for a little while, because it can be so overwhelming. And so I think for me, that's an important aspect of it, is just to know that it's okay to walk away for a little while and come back when I'm in a better headspace. Or find those things that are more life-giving for me, or the songs or the art that provide that inspiration so that I can respond in a better way. This kind of leads into also blending with the other question that Alex asked. I was thinking too about sometimes when we're silent, we think that maybe silence is being complicit. But I would challenge that to say that I don't think it is if we go about it in the right way. If it's a posture of understanding and deep listening, to have a better informed response or action, then I think there's value in silence. If it's silence because I don't want to touch it, I don't want to be involved, that's a whole nother thing, right? We want to ignore what the injustice is. So anyways, I was just thinking that I think it's important, because there's often been times in the work with the LGBT team that I want to shoot off an email that's full of anger, right? Because of something, right? And so, yeah, I might write it, but it sits there and I go away and I come back and either I rewrite it or I decide not to send it, or I go to my community and say, hey, community, what do you think about this, right? And so, yeah, those are just some thoughts. Hopefully, I don't know if that answers your question directly, Natalie. But...
Yeah, and I was going to say something similar to what Brian said at first too, which is like, yeah, being careful not to make like this work the only thing you're doing in your life, even if like, you know, I'm sitting here, a staff person on a social justice organization, right? So it takes up a lot of my time and energy, which mostly is a joy, because I think the work can be helpful, and because it's rooted in being Marianist, it is often, right? Like, which is really beautiful, but it's not always, as Brian said. But I think just making space for everything else you love too, and the light things to carry can fill space too. I think another thing, you know, I think most of us have people in our lives that are passionate about these issues too, and having some of those people just to lean on when things get really hard. I love calling some of my best friends from college when I'm just struggling with something that feels really heavy and I want to ponder together. And I think that's just a good practice. As soon as you bring someone else into the fold, like Mary did with Elizabeth, you know, it's like there's already a seed of joy there, or a seed of connection, or a seed of understanding. I don't know. So I think that's a good practice too, even if it's not necessarily your whole community of 1 million people, but just finding even those one-on-one touch points that remind you of who you are and how you want to be still connected in this work. That can be hard.
One of the things that I've been doing is collecting websites of positive actions. So there are, you know, like one of them is Mission of Mary. Like, you know, when I'm getting down on pollution and stuff, I go to their website, and that, you know, they have stories of families who are starting their garden and, you know, looking at microgreens and all this kind of fun stuff. And that helps relieve the pressure. There are also websites, you know, on any issue that have positive stories from the people who are involved, you know, in there. So you have to find the places to celebrate as well, because it is, otherwise you will burn out. I mean, you will burn out. I remember when we were living in the city, one of the things I loved to do is outside our apartment building, this was the second place we lived, about 4 old guys sat out there every day, poor as could be, you know, never did anything. They just sat in their chair and smoked their cigarettes and drank their beer, but they were some of the happiest people. And so you find those voices as well, of just people who bring you up.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that just real quick, because I was thinking about when Mitch mentioned websites and reading stories about what people are doing, and what I was thinking about were all of the angry websites that are out there. Do you know where people are just very angry about a particular justice issue, and they're doing good work, but their spin on it might not be helpful if you're feeling discouraged already. So that's just something that came to my mind. It's like, oh, but stay away from those. At least that's what I have to do. I have to walk away from some sources of media, even if the people are doing good work, because their way of going about it is not good for the soul, for mine.
We have time for one more question, and Brother Tim rose his hand, so feel free to ask your question.
In the era of resurrection, rising up is fine. As the discussion was going on, I was reminded of a letter, a short letter that Brother Ambrogio Albano, who was the Italian archivist for the SM, a good number of years ago, and that he wrote to Peter Dano. And what he said was this goes back to 2004. And he's referring to the second book that Peter Dano wrote that was published. The first one was Stabat Mater, the second one is this one. Ambrogio says, "Dear Brother Peter, I read your meditation on Mary, Mother of Sorrows, Mother of Defiance. All of Christianity in all ages has preached a Mary, Mother of Sorrows. And you have as well taken up again this tradition and devotion. But this tradition and devotion possibly resigned itself to glorifying Mary for her submission and to considering her as a mother to be pitied. Her own fiat was preached as deliberate and conscious obedience, as subjection, as deference, but when as defiance. I am grateful to you for having chosen to introduce these sentiments and this experience into day-to-day life." That's one comment. The second one is that when we started Maria House for training of poor single women in various skills, many of whom these women were single mothers, one of the things that Peter pointed out was that because a lot of these people were pregnant, of course, at the time, and what can we do? How are we going to survive with our kids in Nairobi? And Peter pointed out that when you look for what do pregnant women in Scripture talk about? Well, the examples he came to was Mary and Elizabeth at the time of the visitation. And of course, that goes right into the Magnificat. And one of the pieces of that, of course, was mothers are concerned about the future of their children. And there were any number of talks to people finishing the course at Maria House about this reality of picking up on this opportunity that will help to raise people up, if nothing else, out of finding a way to get out of dependence on others, or a bit of more money, more ways of getting out of basically taking care of oneself and one's children. And it all comes in this reflection out of some things out of the Magnificat.
Thank you.
I don't think there's a website, Mitch. There would be some stories.
Well, thank you for that. I like that image of Mary as instead of Our Lady of Sorrows, she is the woman who's defiant. I really like that, Mother of Defiance. So just real quick, because we have come to the end of our time, I wanted to just share with you, well, first of all, thank you again to our panelists and to those of you who've joined us, especially to our panelists. I think you've given us a lot to reflect on. I know for me personally, there's been some things that have been said that I would like to sit with. But before you all go, I just want to share with you about our final program in the NACMS Focuses on the Magnificat series. And this is a Marianists Right Now, centered on writing our Magnificats. So if you're not familiar with Marianists Right Now, this is a program that NACMS has run once or twice a year for the past few years. And it's basically a virtual writing workshop that is, there's periods of group interaction, but it's also very reflective. And people have produced some really wonderful reflections. So the main component of the Marianists Right Now is looking at writing your own Magnificat and spending time on that. So it's a Friday night and a Saturday. The Friday component and the Saturday component, you would choose which chunk of time you would be involved in based on your time zone. So the registration for that is now open. It'll close on May 13th. And if you want to know more about that, please reach out. But that will be the last program in our Magnificat series. So yeah, this has been a great series of programs. Most of the programs, including the one tonight, we will put on YouTube with a little bit of editing. So look for that, and I'll send that out to the panelists as well in case there's someone that you would like to send that to, or MSJC if you would want to promote that as well, because I think many people involved in that would be interested in this discussion. Okay, well, I think that's all. So thank you all again so much. Thank you to our panelists. Hope you all have a great rest of your evening.